Carbohydrates have had a rough time of it over the last few decades. We seem to be on a perpetual cycle of the greatest and latest low-carb diet. It is a bit like playing whack-a-mole. As soon as one dies, another pops up. And while we'll have great reverence for protein and more recently for fat, we fear carbs. You could hold up a bank with a banana, people are so afraid of carbohydrates. But more to the point, are there performance and health consequences of consuming a low carbohydrate diet? In this video, I will focus on the performance consequences and talk about the impact to long-term health in subsequent videos. So problem number one is what I have already alluded to in a previous video, and that is loss of economy and/or efficiency. In general, this is defined as the energy or oxygen cost of doing a certain workload. This is one of the key predictors of performance for endurance events. For example, it's been calculated that improvements in efficiency of 1% for an elite cyclist would result in a 48-second improvement in a 40-kilometer time trial. In this study on cyclists, efficiency during 2 hours of exercise at 60% of maximal minute power was compared following 3 days of isocaloric, low, medium, and high carbohydrate intake. The low carbohydrate condition was similar to a low-carb, high-fat diet in that 70% of dietary calories came from fat, and in the high carbohydrate condition, 70% of calories came from carbohydrates. Efficiency was found to be better following the high carbohydrate diet compared to the lower carbohydrate conditions. Heart rate responses were also found to be lower during the higher carbohydrate phase compared to the low carbohydrate phase. The second concern with chronic use of low-carb, high-fat diets is that it downregulates glycolytic pathways and compromises our ability to burn glucose for fuel. Studies show that there is a reduction in the activity of pyruvate dehydrogenase, or PDH, a key enzyme in the glucose metabolic pathway. One study found that after 5 days of high-fat feeding followed by 1 day of carbohydrate refeeding, resting levels of PDH activity were 50% lower. It was also lower during exercise. This reduction severely impairs rates of glucose oxidation and the ability to do high-intensity work. This was demonstrated in a study where cyclists performed a 100-kilometer time trial, after which they performed high-intensity efforts, not unlike a real-world race scenario. Subjects did this following a high-carbohydrate diet or an isocaloric high-fat diet for 6 days, followed by 1 day of carbohydrate loading. Thus, presumably both tests were performed with similar levels of muscle glycogen. Subjects also consumed carbohydrate during the test. Performance on the 100-kilometer time trial was similar for both conditions, not surprising as they had similar glycogen levels at the outset. However, the ability to perform the high-intensity efforts was severely compromised following the high-fat phase, in spite of increased fat oxidation, glycogen sparing, and 1 day of carbohydrate loading. This was no doubt due to compromised glycolytic function. There was also a significant increase in heart rate, as well as a tendency toward a higher perception of effort during training days on the low-carb diet. This study on mountain bikers also found compromised ability to perform high-intensity work following a fat-adapted diet. This was a crossover design and performed during the preparatory period of their training cycle, where a high volume of work dominated the training loads. Athletes consumed either a low-carb, high-fat diet or a higher carbohydrate mixed diet for 4 weeks, followed by a washout recovery week, after which they then switched diets. A continuous effort on a cycloergometer with varied intensity and a duration of 105 minutes was performed after each diet phase. This was designed to mimic the varied intensity of a real-world mountain bike race. Those on the higher carbohydrate diet had significantly higher max outputs and higher workloads at lactate threshold compared to the low-carb keto diet. The authors concluded that the ketogenic diets decreased the ability to perform high-intensity work due to decreased glycogen muscle stores and the lower activity of glycolytic enzymes. Low intakes of carbohydrate over time results in decreased muscle glycogen stores and can be a problem during periods of high training loads, as you can see here. Decreased muscle glycogen is associated, of course, with increased fatigue, increased perception of effort, and reduced ability to perform high-intensity exercise. There are other downsides for athletes consuming a low-carb, high-fat diets that are worth mentioning. Number one, Compromised immune function. This is something I will get into in a subsequent video. Number 2, reduced flow-mediated dilation or compromised artery function. This is where the arteries become stiffened in response to consuming a lot of fat and can no longer dilate in response to increased blood flow. Number 3, a negative impact on our gut microbiome, which can result in chronic inflammation and oxidative stress. I will also get into this in a subsequent video. One result of this impact on the microbiome is that the performance benefits of consuming beet juice, see my short video on doping with beet juice, was also negated. This study found that when athletes consumed a ketogenic, high-fat diet, this damaged the bacterial population in the mouth and thus hurt their ability to convert nitrates from food to nitric oxide. Increased nitric oxide is what delivers the ergogenic benefit. Number 4, blood sludging. This is where the red blood cells lose the ability to repel each other and they clump together. This occurs when a lot of fat gets into the bloodstream. It also compromises the ability of red blood cells to give up their oxygen. Now, there are some conditions cited in the literature during which being more fat adapted could be advantageous. A, ultra-distance events performed where glycogen is depleted at the outset, such as multi-day events. B, when limited or no carbohydrate is available during the event, such as when crossing a polar ice cap. Or C, where individuals have difficulty consuming calories during prolonged events, although this is trainable. The question, of course, is does becoming fat adapted require consuming a high-fat diet, or can this be sufficiently achieved by high volumes of training and training under conditions of low carbohydrate availability? So why do some athletes claim a performance benefit on a low-carb, high-fat diet? Yes, it is hard to argue with a good story or testimonial regarding performance benefits. But to quote Louise Burke of the Australian Institute of Sport, reason to do research. Anecdotes can illuminate, but often bend to your interests. According to Dr. Burke, there are a number of explanations for these anecdotal reports. Number 1, switching to a low-carb, high-fat diet can sometimes reduce body weight, thereby increasing power to mass ratio. And yes, injecting some discipline into your diet, whether it be reducing fat or carbohydrates, can result in reduced caloric intake and subsequent weight loss. Funny how that works. But as to whether a low-carb diet offers superior weight loss benefits, I will discuss that in a future video, but spoiler alert, it doesn't. Number 2, previous diet and training were suboptimal, and the switches associated with greater training and diet discipline. Number 3, the order effect, i.e., you improve just as a result of the natural progression of training and sporting experience. Number 4, placebo effect and or excitement of being part of a new idea or culture. Number 5, the athlete thinks they are adhering to the diet, but really are not, and tweak it to include sufficient intakes of carbohydrate. There are actually numerous examples of this happening where athletes claim to be on a low-carb, high-fat diet, but upon closer examination really weren't. So to summarize, when consuming a low-carb, high-fat diet, fat oxidation rates are increased. However, this results in reduced economy and a loss of metabolic flexibility or the ability to oxidize glucose needed for high-intensity work. These losses continue even after a period of refeeding with carbohydrate. Carbohydrate intake during exercise, as well as high daily intake, continues to be the best ergogenic aid out there. Increased levels of muscle glycogen have been shown to enhance performance in various exercise models, such as prolonged constant efforts, simulated race performance, multiple sprint events, and short-duration high-intensity exercise. Conversely, a low-carbohydrate diet in athletes impairs their exercise tolerance and their ability to adapt to long-term physical training. Here we see that a high-carbohydrate diet resulted in a quadrupling of time to exhaustion. Until studies show this to be the case with low-carb diets, then I am going to continue to eat a lot of carbohydrate-rich foods, albeit of the less processed kind. But what about the more important question about the impact of eating low-carb on your health? In the next video, I will review those studies as well as address the impact that a low-carb, high-fat diet has on the microbiome. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. compared to the low carbohydrate condition.